The Robbins Library has a long history with Science for the Public, which we've kind of restarted recently. This is our second Science for the Public presentation since I've been with this library. And I am so happy to be able to offer a place for people to come and learn about some of the most important topics that we're facing right now, some of the science issues that we are facing in the world. And I know that I am looking forward to tonight's presentation so much. I want to thank Science for the Public so much for partnering with us on this program. And I want to thank Christoph for coming as well. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Yvonne, staff for Science for the Public, and tonight we join with Robbins Library to welcome Dr. Christoph Reinhart and his presentation on designing sustainable urban development. Dr. Reinhart is a professor of architecture and director of the Building Technology Program and the Sustainable Design Lab, all at MIT. He is an international leader in urban design, and he's recognized among other innovations for architectural daylighting, which I think we'll be hearing about, the use of natural light to illuminate building interiors, and urban-level environmental building performance analysis. The design tools developed by the Reinhart Lab are used by architects and urban designers over in more than 90 countries. Dr. Reinhart will describe for us a design approach to urban design, which encompasses energy-efficient architecture, pedestrian-friendly streets, vibrant outdoor spaces, so a very modern approach. Using sophisticated computer modeling, architects, engineers, and planners now combine and analyze the many elements for optimal urban environments just in time. And he'll demonstrate with a model based on a neighborhood proposal in Boston. We are very honored to welcome Christoph Reinhart.
Thanks, Yvonne, for the very kind introduction. I think Yvonne also wanted to note that since this is being recorded, that you please hold on questions to the very end. I love questions during the talk, but it seems to be preferable in this case. So please, due to the recording. Thanks a lot to Yvonne and to Science for the Public for inviting me, and for the Robbins Library for hosting us. And thank you for all of you for coming here. That's really fantastic. Thank you for sharing your, I guess, pre-Thanksgiving Monday with us here tonight, and for staying curious. The work that I'm going to talk about is mostly going to focus on the work from our lab at the urban level, but I'll also do a little bit of introduction about net zero individual buildings today. And since, as you might imagine, a lot of the work is done by many people, this is the Building Technology Program at MIT. It's a post-professional degree program in either way you can get a Ph.D. or a Master of Science in architecture. And we have in total about 6 faculty working in the program on a variety of aspects: energy efficiency in buildings, building controls, natural lighting and daylighting, urban metabolism, more efficient structures. And we strive to bring all this work with our 35 graduate students together by holistically looking at the performance of the built environment. And so, since MIT, after all, is a small university, we tend to always focus and think, well, what are the, how can we contribute to the world's most urgent questions? So I thought, by starting out today, I was reflecting on how can our work in architecture and planning and urban planning address the world's most urgent questions. And that, of course, gets you to the question, well, what might be these problems be? So I came up with 3 key concerns for us. There shouldn't be any surprises here, and I'm going to frame my presentation trying to address these issues. And the first one, not surprisingly, is climate change. And what does this mean for cities? The last 5 years have been the 5 hottest years on record. And in statistics, that's always hard to grasp, but if you look at some pictures, for example, here from the New York Times this summer during the heat wave in June that kept the whole continent basically in its in its claws, you see how desperate the measures. I think these guys are having fun, but ultimately it's a desperate measure to stay cool and comfortable in cities particularly. And equally, another problem or issue is just density, urban density particularly. We have, there are a few numbers worth remembering. We currently have about 1.5 to 2 million inhabitants influx per week in cities worldwide. So it means that every week we are recreating 3 Bostons somewhere in the world, which is probably for many people a scary thought. And of course, we have to house all these people, have to provide them economic opportunities, and figuring ways of how to do that. When at the same time, the third issue is, of course, that society in the world is becoming more and more uneven. So right now, the richest 1% is owning half of the world's wealth. So we have to focus in our cities on all the other 99% and make sure that everybody has a chance at a fair, good, livable life. So now this makes it a little more concrete. So we're asking ourselves, how can architecture and urban planning address climate change, population growth, and societal inequality? And thank God we are obviously not alone there. A lot of people are thinking about these issues. And I think a particularly useful blueprint for change is Sustainable Development Goals project by the United Nations. If you haven't seen that, it's really worthwhile looking at it. It's a couple of years old by now. And they define 17 groups that if we, with target levels, and if in all these areas we meet the targets, we end up with a better world. So it's very specific, and in our field particularly, of course, when we look at cities, then affordable clean energy is a key concern, sustainable communities, and climate change. So documents like this exist, and that's useful as a framework. We've had, of course, trouble in the past finding people paying attention to those goals. And I think one of our key allies right now are these young adults in, for example, Fridays of the Futures, young people that say enough is enough, we have to talk about these issues and we can't keep ignoring them. And I think for us, when we are dealing with cities and municipalities, that due to the political clout that these groups are commanding, we get a lot more attention. So that the notion of not only talking about the almighty US dollar, but also talking about carbon emissions as a viable value has gotten a lot more traction. And also questions that these young people bring to the table. Is it really okay for us to fly on vacation long distances, given the carbon emissions that comes from flight? I think it just changes the mood in society. More on a light level, but I think equally important, I think also our personal goals are changing. So I can't say that I was an avid Dallas watcher when I grew up, and I didn't want to be JR. But if you think about that, I think we all had this diffuse idea that success would mean one day that I live in a big building with a big pool and no neighbors, pretty much, right? And if you look now at Friends and the type of changing just heroes of the shows that we are watching, this value system has changed dramatically. Here are reasonably successful workers that until their mid-30s live in shared housing and spend all their time in cafes drinking coffee, right? That's an incredibly sustainable lifestyle overall. And this becomes the new norm of thinking and a desirable lifestyle, which is a good thing for the planet, right? And then on a technology level, we have, of course, the Internet of Things. So it's this catchphrase, basically, that a lot of more and more electronic devices are connected. Your thermostat being an example. And what this led to is that we have data sets nowadays, and I'll show how we can apply those in a little bit, that are incredibly powerful. We can get, when we work with the right companies, for millions of households what the temperature level is that people set in their buildings. My phone tells me when I should breathe. We know temperatures in very high resolutions all over the world. I know when the yoga studio, Google knows at least when the yoga studio is applied. And there's now this new app that even tells you what food is in your fridge right now. So we can say if we, in meaningful ways that address the privacy concerns linked to these large data sets, if we access this data, then guessing what is happening is officially over. So these are kind of these more broader questions. But I wanted to bring this home, especially for homeowners among us. Well, what does carbon emissions in the built environment actually mean? So here, this is my timetable for buildings. So there are two numbers again. I'm not talking about a lot of numbers, but some numbers are worth knowing that one should be aware of. So today, our global temperature increase vis-a-vis pre-industrial levels is about 0.8 degrees Celsius. And we are emitting every year worldwide 37 gigatons of carbon emissions. And now we have the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have set us these goals that we want to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees C to avoid the worst or even worse effects on the environment, on sea level rise, on diversity in animals all over the world. So this is our goal, right? And if we want to stay under that level, it means we have a total of 580 gigatons of carbon left. And that's really a new concept, because if you think since the 1970s, the limits of growth, we've always been concerned how much gas and oil is left in the world, so how much can we burn? But this concept here basically means it doesn't matter how much is left. This is how much we are allowed to burn to stay under this level. So it changes the way the discussion should be working. And then one other number, or one number that, if at all worthwhile, this you could take home with you. If we say everybody on this planet deserves the same amount of carbon, that gives all of us 2.5 tons of carbon per capita in a year. That would mean that we are all equal, and this is what we have left for the next 30 years. And then, of course, there's a scary line. To stay under this 1.5, we have to reach a net zero carbon economy by 2050. And just bringing that home to buildings, buildings currently use about 40% of the carbon emissions worldwide. So everything what's pink is the built environment. We have to bring that down to net zero as well, which is an incredibly ambitious goal, because 30 years is not a lot. If you think about when you buy or build a new buildings today, you probably expect that buildings to have a longer lifespan than 30 years. So even just putting in a natural gas boiler that will last 25 years or so, the time is running out when you can reasonably do that. Because in 10 years, if you were to do that and we say you cannot burn any gas in 2050 anymore, you have a system that you cannot even use to its meaningful lifespan. So when you look at a graph like this, it becomes maybe clear how incredibly urgent it is that we're doing something now to the built environment. So if you actually go historically back and look at the carbon emissions that are emitted by buildings, this might sound like a total pipe dream, because the only times when our carbon emissions haven't been risen was during financial crisis overall. So maybe the first question is, can we even technologically get to this point here? And then here I just want to point out, this is the world's northernmost and probably largest net zero energy building. It's built by an architecture firm called Snohetta this year in Trondheim, Norway. And what net zero means is that you have a building that is built to a very high efficiency level, so it doesn't use a lot of energy. It has photovoltaic implemented so that it creates energy from the sun, generates energy from the sun. And in this case, this building even has a large battery system in the basement to act as a power station for its environment. So this is a great building. This is how big we can and how large we can take this concept. Of course, the scary thought again is that in this pink circle, this includes all new construction. And by 2030, we are expecting to build another 900 billion square feet. So worldwide, we're going to build 3.5 times the US in the next couple of years. And all these buildings have to fit into this small pink triangle. So it's an ambitious goal. It doesn't mean that it's technically impossible, but it's urgent. So my presentation today, I want to touch on 3 aspects. First, I wanted to talk just a few minutes of what this might mean, how to get to net zero if you're an individual homeowner. So what can you do today? And then I'm going to expand the analysis to beyond energy and carbon and talk about sustainable cities as a whole. But I wanted to bring these 2 topics together here. So net zero home, what can you do? Imagine this is your beautiful small New England home that you just bought, hasn't been upgraded, and now you face with your partner your choices. What can you do? So if it's not upgraded, you'll typically be paying, let's say you have an old gas furnace, about, and I have to look at these numbers from here, about $3,500 a year in gas and electricity utility costs, and you're responsible for 9 tons or 9.9 tons of carbon. So if you're a family of 4, everybody gets 2.5 tons. That means you can't spend any carbon on anything else anymore. This blows your whole budget, so to speak. So now what are some simple things you can do? You can get a mini split system, so an electric heating and cooling system that you put in your buildings that increases your cost to maybe $5,000 a year. And then you could, and since I'll get to that later, electric grid here is pretty clean, that would halve my carbon emission. So if you build this mini split system, put them in anywhere, that already halves your carbon. And now if you spend a few bucks more, and in Cambridge that's being offered, I'm sure in Arlington that's similar, if you get basically a green power supplier, then your costs rise to $6,000 a year, but your carbon emissions are practically zero for all intents and purposes. So that's a pretty easy way of getting your building to net zero. You can feel very good about yourself. What you're actually technologically doing here, you're exporting the problem to the grid, right? Because it means the electric utility, Eversource or whoever you have here, has to deal with all the electricity you are using. You're just putting, so to speak, PV money in the bank, and they have to manage this somehow. If you want to do more than that, you could, of course, also go this long and thorny road to building renovations. So you could say, well, I want to insulate my walls, I want to get new windows, I weather strap and tighten up my building, and then when you do that to a good degree level, you have to get a ventilation, heat recovery system in there, and then you get the heat pump and the PV. If you're doing that, you're a way better neighbor. This is a huge effort, so you might not be married anymore by the time you're done with that because the effort level is so high. But this would significantly reduce the footprint that your building has on the grid. So I just want to give you a sense in terms of options. In both cases, you are net zero, so to speak, but one case is way more thorough than the other nowadays. And of course, when you live in the neighborhood here, you will have a hard time just getting a good contractor that helps you to get to that level efficiently. And just a little bit, if you want to learn more about this, we just created a massive open online class on sustainable building design on this topic, and it starts next January. These classes are offered by edX, which is an initiative by Harvard and MIT, and all these classes are online and for free. So that was more the preamble for individual buildings. What can I do getting carbon emissions down? In our lab, we've been focusing more on this whole notion of sustainable cities, innovation districts, and so forth. And when people are coming to Kendall and to MIT and this whole part of the world, then a lot of cities are interested in an innovation district. So what is that? Kendall Square is a great example. Typically, you have a lot of economic opportunities, meaning you have an anchor institution that provides, or several, a fresh supply of a well-educated workforce. You have a startup culture, and this creates a lot of economic value. Obviously, every city wants something like this as an economic motor, and if we think back, we need this so that we have good jobs everywhere in the world. So then really the environment itself is only there to attract and keep this high qualified workforce. So we need a walkable, mixed-use environment. You can have micro-units, meaning since everybody's working in the Kendall Square area all the time anyhow, you can have smaller units overall, but you need vibrant public spaces, organic food, yoga, all these things. And then energy efficiency and comfortable workplaces are kind of the third tier here. These are the two reasons why people work into the neighborhood and how we maintain cities vibrant. And this comes more as an after effect, even though we just described how important it is for the planet that we are covering that as well. So in our lab, we've been working on basically methods to help municipalities and urban planners to design this neighborhood and look at all these different aspects that are laid out here at the same time. And this is what I wanted to show you. And as an example, it might be easy for you to, especially easy for you to understand this example because we picked this neighborhood here just next to the Innovation District in South Boston. So this is an area that's actually slated for development. It's 170,000 square meters, so 1.7 million square feet. And this would be a typical urban planning, sustainable urban planning proposal for a neighborhood like this. So you could basically get here a mixed-use neighborhood, meaning you have both residential and commercial together. You can have a total of maybe 16,000 people living here, 250,000 square meter of residential, and 130,000 square meter of retail and office space. So when you look at something like this, is this sustainable or not? And it becomes very hard by just looking at it to comparing different options and saying how good is a neighborhood like this. So we're gonna in the following look at this under 8 different angles and just trying to understand how good does this neighborhood perform and could we do better or not. And that is, of course, the key question, especially when you're in urban planning. What are the metrics that shape and form the city? And maybe surprisingly, energy use is less a form giver than other aspects. The 2 main form givers for cities are actually transportation. How do I lay out a street grid that people can walk and bike and so forth? Streets stay forever. If you look at a street grid of Cairo from 3,000 years ago, it looks still the same. So whatever we decide doesn't change. And then the next important part is having access to good light. You can always upgrade the buildings after the fact, but if we have certain massings and we don't let light into the city and onto the streets, then there's no way of changing this after the fact. So what we mostly are working with here is access to daylight. And this gets more into the research that we've done over the years. How do I make sure that my city is livable, that we have enough access to natural light and we are not just all the time in the dark? And for this to work, we developed this, I would say, 5-point plan. How do you as a researcher or as an individual find a good urban metric? Because right now, the literature is full of proposals that how we should look at the built environment. And I think you have to go through all these different steps to see this is a good way of looking at it, it's a meaningful lens, and it does what you want it to do. So that's maybe more academic here conceptually, but the first thing is, of course, you pick a certain quality that you see in a neighborhood and you say, this is what I want to design for. And then you think about different ways. You need a metric that measures this effectively and says, this is a good way of looking at 10,000 buildings at the same time and see if they meet this metric or not. And then, and this is surprisingly for science, but this is often overlooked. How do you know? Just because it's a good idea doesn't mean it's a good metric unless you test it really and see that it does what you want it to do. Then you need efficient ways to calculate it. And finally, you should test how a neighborhood looks according to the metric if you still like it or not. So for daylighting, I'll just walk you through the process here. So daylighting is providing ample natural light over the course of the year to people in a building. This is something that's one of the oldest concerns in architecture, obviously, especially before electric lighting was invented. The history of architecture was the history of the window, was said by Alto, that it's not extreme anymore, but it's one of our key qualities. So nowadays, you would look at an architectural plan like this, by looking at the climate and do a calculation over the whole year and then say how often do people have lights in this building. And the way we are visualizing this nowadays, we say if half the year when you're in the building you have enough light, then it's daylit, otherwise it's partially daylit or not daylit. And that works pretty well in architectural practice and in the studio. When somebody shows you a building, you can do this quick analysis and then decide, is this well daylit or not? So this is a metric that was invented a couple of years ago. And the question was really, sounds good. Does it actually map well with what people say in buildings? So what we did at the time when I taught at Harvard, we used these are all buildings in your neighborhood. We used the Corbusier's Carpenter Center, second floor studio space. And everybody in the class, before they got spoiled with education, just innocent, aspiring architects, got floor plans, and they had to draw where they thought in different spaces the daylighting would end. And then we overlaid this, and we had basically a democratic vote which part of a building is daylit, and we compared that with our computer-based attempt. So in this one space in the world, we were really lucky. The overlap is really good. So that was encouraging. We then repeated that with universities all across the US and South America and Egypt, and we found similar evidence, which is pretty rare in architecture, that you get to that point that you can say, this metric tells you what people think where daylight is. And that's pretty useful, because ultimately we all do all of this for the occupants in the building. So then we were happy that we had that. We then found, I'm not going to go into details here, a way to do these type of analysis for a whole city. So I can basically, what I just showed you this, I can now pretty effectively do for the whole of Manhattan, for example. So I can tell you how daylit Manhattan or downtown Boston is. So now that we have this awesome tool set, we wanted to understand, well, what are the cities or the forms, the urban forms that are getting rewarded by this metric? And some of you might know that the oldest urban zoning regulations for getting access to light and air on street levels in cities come from Manhattan. And they were in 1970s. Manhattan was the first city that said, because due to the very dense urban canyons, these are unlivable street conditions, you have to widen up the amount of light that you get at the street level. And if you look at a building such as the Rockefeller Center, it's basically built according to that, right? It has this step back. That's the maximum the developer was allowed to build. So we wanted to see, can you basically build in Manhattan denser than the Rockefeller Center? So for that, we looked at different typologies. So here you basically see various urban setups, and here the same architectural idea grows. And these buildings become incredibly dense, 3-4 times denser than Manhattan if we were to build a whole city. So we wanted to see, are there urban forms that are good for lighting or not? And I'd like you to pay attention to this top form. That works very well. So these are effectively several stories of commercial base at the bottom, and then the stacked, very thin tower. And if you look actually south of Central Park, that's the kind of urban typology you see. And here, what I'm going to show you now is how good these different typologies actually work in a city. So here we see them growing by density, and this is a good lighting level. So the top level that I showed you, these thin towers, perform way better than the others to incredibly high levels. This is the maximum you can build in Manhattan. So we could basically double the density in Manhattan if we were building according to that. And that takes me to the earlier notion we have to house a lot of people in cities. We don't want urban sprawl, so we have to densify. So there are ways of actually getting a lot more living space into cities if we build that way. And of course, it's interesting just from a developer standpoint. You're creating here, if you do that in Manhattan, $1 billion worth of real estate per building block. So that doesn't hurt if you're the developer. So if I apply that actually to the neighborhood that I just showed you before, when we were saying, well, is that a good neighborhood or not, then it actually turns out it's not that great. It's basically not Gotham yet, but it's barely acceptable. And the reason is that there's a height restriction here. You can only build up to 7 stories high. So if you say you have to design that much floor area, you basically box yourself in, literally speaking. And that just shows that we have to do this educational work with cities and explaining, well, you have to relax some of your growth and height requirements if you want density and light and have these things work together. Because the fear is, of course, well, if I allow higher buildings, everything is just going to rise up. And you just have to find something more clever than that. So now we have some light, hopefully, in buildings. But what do we actually know about how people use buildings? What if we design all the spaces and nobody's there, ever? So that is hard, and it's a moving target because, of course, working patterns are changing. We always say in the lab, most of the students don't like to come in the lab, or they spend some time in the lab, but they think their most productive time, and I would agree, spending a day or so, actually a coffee space at different places, working for themselves, uninterrupted work. So we just have to accommodate these changing working patterns and just understand when are people where in buildings. And in order to do that, we worked here at this place in Cambridge that you might know. This is the MIT North Court. It is, let's see if that works. It's located near the Stater Center and the Koch Institute. It's a public space, and it's very vibrant. There are all kinds of benches here. It's being used extensively for people from the whole Kendall area as well as MIT, the MIT community for lunch. And that's because there are 2 public cafeterias there, and you can sit inside and outside. So for us, that was a perfect spot to study, because whoever is sitting outside has the choice, because they could sit inside as well. So when we wanted to understand how do people use dense spaces like this and when do they use them. And in order to do that, we used 3 of these SUFA solar-powered benches that you might have seen. There are more and more in Boston. There are these red benches with solar power where you can charge your iPhone. They also have a Wi-Fi tracker in there. So what we've done is we had for 11 months SUFA collected all the signals that smartphones were sending out. So this is maybe a little lesson. Privacy in the modern age. If you have a phone and your phone is on Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi is on, your phone screams non-stop into the world, I'm a phone, and this is my Mac ID. Now, we didn't keep the Mac ID. We just changed it into an encrypted ID number, and we threw it away after the study. There are lots and lots of companies that collect this all the time. You can put a Wi-Fi sensor in front of your living room and collect everybody who walks by. That is totally legal and fine. Just to give you a sense. In this case, this is what we collected. And this next graph shows you what you can basically gather here. So we collected, in 11 months, 30 million probes. We had to clean them up to 14 million probes. We threw away the weekends, so we were interested in weekdays. And then we got 670,000 visitors to MIT and 16,000 regulars. And how do you know what is what? Because, of course, your phone gives you the same Mac ID. So you can say this is somebody that is here at least every 2 weeks. So from a scientific standpoint, this is absolutely great, because we wanted to know how do the regulars use the space. And usually cities don't know that at all, when and how it's being used. So with this, and we wanted to know it for the regulars, because when you're visiting from far away MIT and it rains, you're still going to go there. It's not that you are saying, I'm going home. Whereas when you're a regular, you can decide, I want to have lunch now outside or not. So it becomes very specific. And this allowed us to test various metrics on a way larger scale than had been done before. So this is work that comes out of Europe. There's a metric called the Universal Thermal Climate Index. And that's an equivalent temperature. That's similar to when in the winter it's very frosty and it's windy and they say the temperature feels like, and then they give you a lower temperature. We basically have this concept now where we can put into a temperature, clothing level, activity, all these things, and we say overall, all things being equal, the equivalent UTCI temperature means you're feeling this way or another. So it's a really powerful way of summarizing the human experience in terms of thermal comfort. It's hard to calculate, but we went all out and calculated it for the North Court for every hour in the year, on a 5 by 5 meter grid during our period, to be able to say how are people going to feel within the space. And the purpose was to say, was that a waste of time, or is that actually a good idea? Should we design and plan cities with that? And that would, for example, help us as well if we think of in the Boston Common where all these new high-rises come up. We can basically, rather than doing this direct shading studies that are not really meaningful, frankly, we can, with this over the whole year, decide way better how do people feel in the space. So this is how this looks like, basically, where it's wet, it's hot. This is just to give you an example. We did that for the whole year. And the work was done by Jay Daribal from our lab. He spent 1.5 years for the next graph. So we were all nervous. We were hoping the next graph wasn't a waste of time. And fortunately, it wasn't, especially for Jay. So what this shows you is for 16,000 people over a whole year, how UTCI at the bottom describes when people are in the space. That's an absolutely gorgeous graph, right? Because it shows you clearly what you want to see. There are fewer people when it's cold. People stay here for lunch when it's comfortable and a little warm, and then it falls off again. And this is for 16,000 people. So with this, we could effectively show that this metric is exactly what you should be using to model outside conditions in cities anywhere. And you can, for example, decide where do you want to put the next public library, where should the public library have a cafe so that people actually stay and support the library there. You can decide where do you plant trees so that people walk along this way, so it becomes a more walkable city. That's a really powerful tool overall. This is my favorite graph from this study. So this just shows you in the North Court how long does the MIT community have lunch. And when the weather is terrible, the medium lunch is 8 minutes, and when it's divinely perfect, it's 12 minutes at MIT. But there are some slackers who have 20-minute lunches out there. I'm just dying to do the same study in other parts of the world. So now at least we have a good, powerful urban metric, right? So, and when I apply it to the metric here, it's not that exciting because this neighborhood wasn't developed with this metric in mind. So this effectively tells you half the year on Boston streets it's not comfortable, which as you live here, you know that's true. So we should now be more deliberate about putting shading system in, heating pavements. I think there are a lot of interventions we can do because the value we create for society by getting people walking is of course substantial. So this lets me to metric 2. The other ones will be a lot faster. So now we basically can say we know how to get light into cities. We know how people are comfortable. Now we have to give people destinations. That's the next step, right? Because people need a reason to walk out. There has to be a restaurant. There has to be something. Fortunately, there is a metric called Walkability and Walk Score. I'm not sure if you know that. It's called walkscore.com. You can look that up for any address in America. And it basically gives you an address, tells you how many amenities you have in the neighborhood. So how many schools and restaurants and so forth you have. And then there's a fall-off. Effectively, the further an amenity is, the less it counts. What do we know about how this metric works? Well, we know that people who live in a neighborhood with a high walk score weigh on average 6 to 10 pounds less. That's a very indirect metric, but that's what the statistics can tell us right now. We also know that a point of work score adds $3,000 to the average real estate value of your property. And typically a walk score goes between 0 and 100, so that's not nothing. And yeah, you have to, of course, be careful. This was developed for the US. We've done that in other parts of the world as well, such in the Middle East, where the distances that people are willing to travel are a lot shorter overall. So if I apply this to my neighborhood here, everybody was super optimistic. This whole neighborhood is basically covered in cafes and restaurants. It's very walkable. We don't have yet the a finance model that sees how many of these cafes are actually going to make it. But in principle, when we start out, this is walkable. So now we get to energy. And energy is for new construction a lot simpler than what I showed you before. When you have an existing building, it's just a very tricky thing. You don't want to take down the existing building, but as we talked a bit about, upgrading a building is very costly and very complicated. Defining a stringent building code is a lot easier, and actually we know from studies in California and all over the world that people follow, thank God, the building code. So for example, if in Kendall we say every new building has to be LEED Gold or whatever, people build to that level, and then we know the energy use is there. It's the hardest problem for us getting the existing buildings up to speed. So that means in this neighborhood, since we're building it from scratch new, we are assuming here slightly better than Massachusetts code. We get pretty low energy use overall. And then the way you would now judge, is this a good energy use per square meter compared to other neighborhoods? There are data sets out there that, for example, compare for you mixed-use neighborhoods all over Climate Zone 5, which Boston is located, against your target here. So you could say, well, this looks good. I'm in the top 20% or so. So this is a way how an urban planner could gauge whether this is efficient as a building stock or not. Now the next part, that is really something that we are starting to discuss more and more, which is where's the energy coming from? When I said earlier on, well, I buy a heat pump and I buy green PV, photovoltaic, that exports the problem. What that means, somebody, the grid utility, has to be responsible for somewhat getting us clean energy and using this clean energy, and that's a difficult problem, if you think about it, with photovoltaic, it's easy to understand. The sun doesn't always shine, but people want always energy. So there's this mismatch. So somewhat we have to bring those together. So we looked here at 3 different systems that are currently for a new neighborhood under discussion. The default would be this. So by default, everybody, that's probably what you have at home, you have a gas boiler in the basement, and you just get electricity from the grid. That is pretty normal. Now what you can do instead is go what is called all electric. So you throw away your gas boiler, or you never had one, and you have basically heat pumps. So electric heating and cooling systems, if they are large, they use heat from the ground. Otherwise, they can just get the heat from the ambient air. In that case, I only have electricity, and I heat and cool buildings with that. Or, and this is what you typically found when you have one joint owner, for example, Harvard, MIT, you would have the utility buys gas and creates its own electricity heating and cooling centrally with a district system. That is very common. So you basically have one central plant that creates heating and cooling, and then there are steam pipes that connect to various buildings. That's what we've done for at least 50 years. So now, how do these decisions, these systems pan out from an environmental and from a cost standpoint? So if you go all electric, you see here, that's in orange, you have the cleanest system in terms of carbon emission. If you go all gas, you have the cheapest. So that is super important. That basically makes it even harder for us to save carbon because we have a mismatch between the economics and the environmental concerns. So why is that? And that's actually something that we started only recently point out. Here you see the electric grid of New England. So if you lived here for more than 20 years, that's your history. That's the history of your grid. If we go back 20 years, we had a large amount of coal and oil-powered power plants, and of course gas. And the rest is nuclear, and up there that's renewable energy. So now what happened is due to hydraulic fracturing or fracking, we have a huge amount of very, very cheap natural gas. And what that did over 20 years, it basically knocked out all the coal and the oil-powered power plants. They just went out of business here. So that means today, most of our electricity comes from gas and from renewable. Renewable is carbon neutral. Gas has a way better efficiency than coal and oil. So people thought always this was a good idea. And if you look actually at the carbon emission from our grid, they have halved over 20 years. So that is really interesting. If you have done nothing, you can still pat yourself on the back and say, I use half the carbon that I used 20 years ago because my grid is so much cleaner. But now that starts creating a problem because nothing is replacing the natural gas, right? And if we say we have to get out of this natural gas loop, it's actually stopping right now, for example, solar hot water systems that are being used in other parts of the world. Nobody has that here because the gas is just too cheap. So now we have to basically start deciding, well, how do we overcome that, which is a problem. So in our neighborhood here, we just said, okay, how much do you actually pay? What is the actual pay difference that you are looking at? So if I want to switch from to all electric from gas, then everybody in my neighborhood pays per year $90. That seems feasible. With that, I'm halving my carbon emission. So effectively, we have to basically go between what would the individual decide, is $90 enough, as opposed to what is the cheapest solution we can overall have. So in this case, we said $90, innovation district, no problem. So that's, of course, a positive attitude that the developer goes with that. But we basically say that would be our solution here, all electric system. So now I end up with only 0.3 tons of carbon per person. If you think back, the New England house we started off, that was 2.5 tons per person. So this is significantly better. These are our solutions for buildings. Now you might think, well, what about photovoltaic? Is anybody here has a PV system on their roof? Awesome, very good, great. So what about PV for a whole new neighborhood? Well, you could get carried away and fill the whole neighborhood with PV. That might not necessarily be the best idea from an urban planning level, because you want all this density and people, you want them to enjoy the city. You want the Rachel and the Joeys on the rooftop partying as well. So I think there has to be more diversity. So we said we're just going to cover about 20% of the rooftops with PV. The rest of the PV, if we really want it, can be outside because we can just wire it in. It's cheaper anyhow. And that way we have more, we can manage any stormwater better, and we have more vibrant neighborhoods. So this is how this would look like if you were to create, cover 20% of your electricity with local PV, and the other green roofs are for other purposes because rooftops are valuable. And so this is some new work that we're adding towards that, which is how can we help owners to decide that they're doing some good in the world, and what is the good work worth. This is work that we do with Harvard School of Public Health, Memo Cedeno and Joe Allen, who have quantified for all parts of the US, if I'm avoiding fossil fuels, how much favor do I do to society? So the avoided cost to society by using less fossil fuels. And basically, the costs come both from reduced climate change as well as prevented heat health outcomes. So if we put a price tag basically to having all electric instead of all natural gas in that neighborhood, we are saving society $400,000 in this case, which comes out to $25 per year. Now that's nice, so you can say anybody who moves in the neighborhood, that's what you do good. Of course, it's important to understand nobody's going to give you that money. That's something that's good, that's good that you do to society that nobody pays you back, but it's important to realize that this is value that's there. So this is where we are. There are a few more concerns to cover here. One is embodied energy, which is something that we haven't talked too much about, especially outside of academia, but it becomes more and more important. This is the amount of energy and carbon that's required to build and maintain buildings. And it's easy to understand when you pour the concrete that comes at a huge carbon emission price tag. So how does this compare to my utility energy, operational energy meter? And traditionally, we've said this is very low, less than 15%. But if you think about it, over a 70-year lifespan of a building, the embodied energy tends to be low. Now, of course, when we follow all these concepts that we talked about and we have a net zero building, then the embodied energy is everything that we have. So over time, this will become more and more important. For our neighborhood here, we can say for a 50-year lifespan, about 11 years of operation correspond to that. So it's about 2.2 tons of carbon per person, but over 50 years. The main argument why we should pay attention to embodied energy is, of course, when we build a new building, all this carbon is used now. So if I'm saying we have 550 gigatons of carbon left, anything we're building, even if it's a low energy building, we are burning our budget down really, really quickly, which is ultimately an argument why we should do refurbishments, renovations of building, rather than just building new from scratch. And two more lenses on the city. One is work that we've done with the Real Estate Innovation Lab, where we try to understand how can we overcome this conflict between carbon emissions and economics. And the Real Estate Innovation Lab works with the big investors of the world. So we have the investors looking at a green building, is it a good idea? And then we have the poor designers looking at the green building, and nobody talks to each other. And we try to basically, and I love this slide, hold hands and bring our tools together and try to better understand, can we create more synergies here? And since we've always been working extensively on daylighting, we started looking at daylighting first, more specifically in Manhattan. So we got for 5,000 rental commercial spaces in Manhattan information about what people are paying, everything the real estate sector knows about these 5,000 floors. And for 5,000 floors, you see them all here in Midtown, Lower Manhattan, we created an urban model. We calculated for every hour of the year the light that falls onto every square foot of that building, and we can then deduct how daylit is this floor. And we threw that in something that the real estate sector calls an hedonic pricing model. This is what they use all the time. If you think you're in real estate, you want to predict how much rent you can charge for your building, right? So you basically throw in things such as how old is my building? How is the economy doing? Where is it located? Do I have high-speed internet, transportation, accessibility? And based on that, they come up with a number and then hope for the best that somebody's going to pay the price. And what we did here, we threw in basically what they didn't have before, access to light in there. And we found that in Manhattan, just having access to light on a floor increases the value by 5 to 6% on the rent or the mortgage that you pay. Now, the interesting part, of course, this matters greatly because that's always a good number to remember. In the US, 1% of your building costs for a company are energy, about 10% are your mortgage, and the whole rest, the other 90% come from the productivity of your workers. So obviously the salaries you pay are the biggest ticket item, but just if you get 5% on the mortgage, that means that's half of your energy costs for the building. So having this city even just above Gotham daylit already covers about 13% of my energy bill for the whole city. So this we know will be the ultimate driver why you see very more specific daylit buildings popping up, because the value that you create is just so large. And then finally, and this has been really fun, we've been starting to think about food as well and how much does it matter what you eat in terms of the carbon that you're generating. And we've been working with a company out of South Boston called Freight Farms. They're selling this refurbished shipping containers. Here you see one from the inside. So these are systems, these are food machines. You can put them in your basement or anywhere. You basically condition the space, you have these grow lights, and you can grow enormous amounts of food in there. And we wanted to understand, well, is that a better idea? What about green fields? What happened to green fields? We did a very extensive measurement on one of these containers, put a weather station on the roof, and we got all the food that comes in and comes out. And it turns out that in certain areas, including in Boston, it is actually carbon-wise better to grow some of our food in these containers than what we're currently doing. And the reason for this is, of course, the food miles. If you think about it, the average tomato travels, I think, 3,000 kilometers to New York, to Manhattan, because 15% or so come from the Hudson Valley, but New Yorkers and Bostonians eat tomatoes all year round, and then they come from California and Chile, right? So with this, you can effectively place this right on top of supermarkets and have a completely closed economy there, so to speak. So we wanted to understand that better, and first we started with what do people eat? And that might be fun for everybody here. So we defined basically the average Joe, that's a typical American. The typical American diet per year is 3.2 tons of carbon, which is massive if you think about it. Again, our budget is only 2.5 tons, so just what we eat, we're completely blowing our budget. And here you see where this is coming from. The biggest ticket item is the red from red meat, or meat in general. So then we started to try to understand, well, what happens if we change our diets, right? So the urbanite here, we call somebody who tries to avoid red meat and eats mostly chicken. And that already saves you 0.5 ton. And all vegan, obviously, means no more meat at all. What a sad existence. And but basically, these are the 3 types, just to give everybody a sense. How does this pan out at the urban level? And we assumed we would have 30% average Joes, 50% urbanites, and 20 vegans in that neighborhood. And now we wanted to say, well, can we feed everybody with these type of containers, at least for the produce? And this is how a city like this would look like. And you don't have to put them on the rooftops. It's more to give you just perspective. So if we want all the produce locally generated, we have this tool that is like the Apple Watch. You have to fill your rings for all the different food groups. So if you do that, let me see if I get some of the numbers. We have a budget of about $11 million. This is what 15,000 people would spend on produce per year. And the extra costs of creating all of this locally here is about $1 million. So we have to basically hope that people are willing, this is like organic food practically, to pay this extra premium. But the nice thing is, especially thinking back to the beginning of the lecture, we would create about 430 jobs here, new jobs for people taking care of these containers. So, And I think that that's probably the biggest driver, because $1 million a year for 400 jobs is nothing. And otherwise the whole system pays for itself. And in this case, we would also save about 300 tons of carbon. So not a lot. The reason for this is that we are growing all produce here locally. Typically, there are some low-yield produce that you wouldn't grow in these containers because the economics just don't work in your favor. So you start with herbs and salads typically. But it's just to give you a sense of how something like this would pan out for the city. So I have, how do you term-wise? So we are here, I have a couple more slides. So this basically allows us to look at a city like this way more holistically. We can basically say, how well is it daylit? How likely is it that people are going to walk around the city? How efficient is it from an energy standpoint? Can we create local green jobs? And how much food do we get overall? The last few slides are just to show you a little bit, because we try to have an impact. How do we change minds? If we show that to people, are they going to believe it or not? And I give you 3 little case studies where we try to do that. The first one was pretty traditional. So we had been paid by the government of Kuwait to develop one of these methods. So we all, this is Carlos Cerezo, Nathaniel Jones, and I from our lab, put on our best suits and flew to Kuwait. And we met there basically 20 people from industry and from government and showed them with the methods that we have developed, how could you reduce the carbon emissions of the whole country by 85%. So basically here, this is the city of Kuwait and various off-the-shelf upgrades, some PV. This is how low you could go. And we just wanted to see how they react to that. Nobody questions content-wise what we've done. Everybody believed us. They just wanted to know, does this pay for itself? Understandable. And we could say no, because in Kuwait, they sell electricity for less than a cent per kilowatt hour, even though it costs them 16 cents per kilowatt hour. So that's not a winning economic strategy to begin with, so nothing really pays. So then we had this discussion, well, you should raise your energy prices and have tiered pricing systems. And then this is really funny. This is what happened after we had this discussion. They announced we're going to introduce tiered pricing systems. And not surprisingly, since the locals were used to paying very low for their energy, they complained and said, we can't do that. And so what is interesting, people question that whether it's really a good idea to change appliances in buildings and so forth. Don't we just need better air conditioning system? But physically speaking, when you live in the desert, you should actually have efficient appliances, efficient lighting, because otherwise your equipment heats the building, so you have to cool away twice. So anything you save on the equipment saves you double, so to speak. So in order to show that this is a case, here's our payback analysis. If you don't have the current pricing, you basically have payback times of 50 years. That's not very attractive. And when you have some tiered pricing, we have it to the lower level. What happened in this study? It's like a partial success. Basically, they said, that's great. We introduce higher pricing, but only for the expats. Everybody else keeps. So it was an attempt, but it just, for us, it's interesting because we want to see what is happening, what's the impact. Then we had a more playful application. This is here with the MIT Media Lab with Kent Larson's group, where we built a real-time version, a Lego table of our tool. So basically, we have a real-time version of the tool. We developed this game here with 18 different Lego pieces, and you could design your city, and we were projecting the results live on top of it. And we just wanted to see how people are responding to daylight, energy, and walkability. This is the planning board in Riyadh, and we have some great footage where people are arguing in Arabic over the Lego table. So it shows that it's a good tool to engage people. We then did this once more during MIT Open House. We had 20 people walk by the table, and 2,000 people accidentally kicked the table. So we spent all day just cleaning up the Lego pieces. Then people left their kids with us, unbelievable, and the kids started stealing the Lego. So I'm not fully convinced that's the future for my urban planning. So what we're doing instead, and that's my second to last slide, we work with these online tools where effectively anybody that's interested in upgrading their community sees their house or the house of their neighbors, and you get a budget. And just by clicking, you can say, I want to upgrade the energy use or the water faucets or the PV of the whole neighborhood. and basically see how many jobs I'm creating and how much good I do. And the idea here behind is that we have more collaborative urban planning behind that, basically. Everybody says, this is my best shot of spending $50 million. And then you submit your proposal, and then at least the city can get a sense what the citizens want. And it's based more on science than just thinking, I heard PV is the be-all and end-all solution. So it helps you to become a little more nuanced. So some final thoughts. Net zero is something that as individuals we should start considering for our buildings as fast as we can in the next years. Don't buy a gas burner. Anybody here? When it comes to cities, the question becomes a little more nuanced and wider. We cannot just look at energy use. We also have to look at all the other aspects of the environment that I talked about. Do we have good access to daylight? Can people walk? Is there economic opportunities? Because if we don't get this right, the first point is not going to happen because people won't have the means of doing that. And of course, the financing can be a challenge, so we will be spending in our lab more and more time on trying to basically at least call out this mismatch and hopefully find financial schemes on how to overcome it over time. And with that, I thank you for your time.